thank you very much for that long introduction. So I think I'll keep my talk shorter, so it doesn't supersede the length of my talk. It's a deep honor and privilege to be invited by the AIM. I was told that Mr. Rajesh couldn't be here today, but I want to thank the Indian Consulate of India, the Consul General of India, Mr. Srinivasan, Mr. Nandan, and my guest, Bob Millens, if I can refer to you as such. I'd like to start out on a personal note. I'm going to take maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes. I don't want this to be a long talk because I'd like to see a discussion with questions and interaction. My talk will have about 5 parts to it. I want to talk about the historical origins of the Constitution, the significance of this day, the Constitution Day, as many of my colleagues have already attested to, the enduring legacy of that, why is it important, the legacy of Ambedkar and Gandhi, but also look back and see how momentous of an achievement the 1949 event is, and then the establishment of the Republic in 1950, given the legacy of colonialism. And I want to link that to what I think is a specific articulation of the Indian spirit and the Indian mind. To overcome centuries of colonial oppression, and then to draw from the best constitutional traditions, leveraging our best minds to produce the living document and its eternal framework. We have to go back in time and rediscover how momentous of an achievement that is when it comes from people who have been oppressed. And then finally, I want to link that to contemporary events that point to the tremendous display of Indian success around the world. The relationship between the United States and India is strong. I think it's only going to get stronger. The best is yet to come. And to see how our achievements and the conditions for success perhaps derive from the very principles that are embedded in the Constitution, which itself is unique to the Indian subcontinent and its civilizational history, the complexity of all the ancient religions in one society, the daunting task of managing the complexity of the Indian subcontinent in its pluralism, in its differentiation, in its social stratification, in its antiquity. The oldest living traditions may and perhaps come from this particular part of the world. And I say it has a fundamental relationship to both the secular constitution and the conditions for success in the future. By way of a personal note, just a quick introduction. I came here when I was 3 months old. My father is from Tamil Nadu, as is my mom. He was an army doctor in India. His father, who was also from Tamil Nadu, was picked up by the British as a young man. He was orphaned because his dad had dismantled the family, and so as an orphan he was picked up by a British carrier as a very young man and realized he was a pretty smart guy, so they gave him an MD. He fought in World War I and World War II under the British as a doctor, and then after independence he decided to barter his skills in the rural villages in Tamil Nadu rather than join an organ hospital. So both my grandfather and my father provide tremendous inspiration. I see the 2 flags behind us that shows the synergy and patriotic duty towards nations and the compassionate will and spirit that comes from our innate Indian sensibility is driven for higher purposes, as we'll see in some of the country. Higher purposes than any individual ambition. Both gentlemen to me represent the best of self-sacrifice, which I see in our founding fathers. So, I don't want to go into too much detail about the historical origins. I think we've heard brilliantly from both Millens and our 2 speakers as to the significance. I appreciate Mr. Srinivasan's indication that in 2015 it was a significant event for Prime Minister Modi to turn this day into the Constitutional Day, something that we can always reflect on. But specifically, when we look at the historical origins, and we look at the achievement of Ambedkar, he took, along with his commission, the existing constitutions, some of the best in the world, dating back to the Magna Carta for England, and then the French Revolution and its constitution, the American Constitution. He took the elements and the parts and synthesized that, which to me is indicative, again, of this amazing talent that we have in our culture and our civilization, our mindset, which is to pull from a diversity and draw upon a unified document. E pluribus unum, when people speak about the one and the many and difference in unity, the Indian subcontinent truly reflects that principle to manage such diversity. Well, what are those basic structures of the Constitution? You have a federal structure, a complete respect for the parliamentary system. You have the separation of powers, both drawn from the British and American models, that guarantees balance in our society. So one particular organ of government can't usurp the power of the other. The judiciary review itself is emblematic of that stability. Constitutional supremacy, the doctrine, means that the Constitution is what we commit to, not the reigning parties or the shifting political winds. That we have an enduring commitment to these principles of equality, fraternity, liberty, and justice. Equality means equal protection under the law. The genius of this Constitution, which, by the way, back in 1949 may be more progressive than what we see in the American Constitution and its limitations today. And I say that openly. The right to an education. That's phenomenal. The right to health. The right to life. What's built in our civilization is a fundamental compassion and respect for all facets of life. The environment, culture, people, individuals. There's no separation. When we say equality under the law, we mean equal respect for the dignity of every single human being. That too is a part of the legacy of both Connecticut and Ghana. Fraternity means essentially a spirit of cooperation. The language isn't there in that particular phrase, but when they said socialist, secular, democratic, the key point was in 1949, the socialist, not by a definition today as a political doctrine or an organizational principle, but as Austin Randall spoke of, the Constitution is a social document. Society and the demands that we place on each other to take care of each other supersedes the constraints of the law. It is a living document, it's a social document. India cares about its society. It cares about the unity and the difference. So I think that's very key that we understand what we mean by a constitutional document being a social document in its nature. A couple more aspects of the very structure of the Constitution and what I think makes it unique. Constitutional supremacy, the Republican and Democratic forms of government, direct election by the people to the Lok Sabha. Republican in the sense that it's representative. People represent the interests of the broader population. A very key point, which I differentiate from our own First Amendment in the U.S. Constitution, is what we mean by the secular character. Secular, on the one hand, can mean that government should not impose a single religion on such a diverse population, where many religions coexist and many interpretations. But inversely, government should not get in the way of the free expression of so many different religious preferences. It should not get in the way of allowing people the freedom to fund their own institutions and their own principles and their own rituals and their own schools. So it's twofold. It's the respect of the diversity of religions. There's an inherent flexibility, I think, in the pluralism and the innate democracy of our civilization and culture. We respect difference, which then promotes the liberty of thinking and the freedom of conscience to debate. And as the economist Amartya Sen said, the argumentative nature of the Indian mind is precisely the successful ingredient you need to have a democracy. There are many attempts to build democracies around the world. Post-2011, after decolonization and the collapse of the empires in Europe, the extraordinary event of the American Revolution, in a way, a sort of sister event, that was also an event of decolonization. But what makes the Indian Constitution and the Indian movement unique? It's the ability to see as a spiritual dimension, this is my argument. I don't say religious, but I see something morally, ethically binding that allows us to respect differences, allows us to respect differences of opinion, allows us to engage in the vibrancy of debate, allows us to pursue social justice, and to hold institutions accountable. It allows us to feel the suffering of others, the empathy and compassion towards others, and to take a stance on fundamental human rights violations. And when we say it's an eternal framework, but something that evolves over time, think about this as an example. 2015, the Indian Supreme Court essentially legalized transgender as a third category. You might say, well, I may personally disagree or agree, or leaving aside your own political issue or personal feelings about the matter. Think about the constitutional achievement. Western democracies can't even do this, and admit to do this. And what did the Supreme Court do in its decision? It drew from the fundamentals of Hindu mythology in trying to make a justification for the respect of other people's way of living and how they identify. That's extraordinary. And that's coming from the South Asian context. So my argument is that the Constitution is a social document that appeals to changes over time and is respectful of differences, can draw on the basic principles of democracy in the defense of new rights. I'd say I'm most proud when I read the document, the longest constitution in the world, as my colleagues have said. In part 3, when you look at the statement on rights, and what I find there is a more refined language than you may find in many Western constitutional frameworks. There's an extreme sensitivity about discrimination, about the right to all facets required necessary to lead a dignified life, like health care and education. Yes, as Ambedkar discussed, debated, and conflicted with in the founding moments, we know that his objective was to annihilate caste. In the written document, there is an abolition of untouchability, but perhaps maybe not an abolition of the caste system. But what the document does guarantee is that we should protect each other from discrimination on the basis of caste, or sex, or religion. And with the decision on transgender, one can say sexual orientation and sexual identity. Therein lies the flexibility of the document. It respects differences, and yet it protects us from fundamental inequalities and illiberalisms that can rise when one group tries to take power over another. Okay, I want to move quickly to the question of the legacy of colonization, and then we can talk about the modern significance of the Constitution today with regard to what I'm saying about the conditions for Indian success in all facets of society, public and private sectors, and all institutions. Again, I go back to the example of my father and my grandfather. They tell us stories as whether you're second generation, third generation. These days we're seeing emerging fourth generation. But it's very hard for those in the second generation to understand the testimonies from our fathers when they immigrated and said, I came on first 6 pounds because he went to England first for his residency, and then he came to the United States. I don't know what the conversion of 6 pounds is, but I can't imagine it being a lot. Or if someone says I came on very little. But to see the energy and to see the commitment, the very ahimsa, detach yourself from the fruits of what you're trying to achieve and focus on the duty and the conviction to succeed. And he told me remarkable things I have to take for granted. I'm the beneficiary of all of his hard work. He says things that we Indian immigrants had to work 3 times as hard just to be seen as equals with the majoritarian society. For his generation, perhaps it was the engineers, the doctors, and the technicians and the scientists that might have got given the first opportunity, but because of the foundations they laid, given the enormous struggle, because he lived before, as a child, before independence, his father certainly was before independence, and then he saw the birth of the nation, and he saw that as the condition for his own success before he came to the U.S. And what I can take away from that is that the commitment to hard work, the understanding that we as Indians, 2.5 million, maybe 3 million in this country, what that first generation was able to achieve from the 1960s and 70s when they came in large numbers, and now we continue to grow. Let me put out some statistics for you, and I hope I'm not misstating the facts. How many people would dispute that within a generation and a half, the leading ethnic group in the United States, measured by higher education, graduate degrees, post-baccalaureate, MD, JD, PhD, MBA, the most successful group in the shortest amount of time and the highest percentage of people come from the Indian community. Perhaps the highest growth of income and wealth creation between the Silicon Valley and the corporate industries by a single generation and a half. Initially, our contributions were in engineering and science and medicine, but now you see in politics, in media, in law. Before Barack Obama chose Merrick Garland, I think he entertained the idea of a justice in D.C. who's a young Indian American. Could have been the first Indian Supreme Court justice if he would have gotten the nomination and the selection. Needless to say, you're seeing the excellence and the proliferation of talent in all sectors and facets in institutions. And to me, that's remarkable. That shows us that we can break down the barriers and the differences that allow different groups to arise. We have the strategies and the tools to integrate very quickly and succeed. You can ask, well, how does that derive from the principles? Once again, the commitment to justice as both an intellectual pursuit and a practical pursuit. Intellectual meaning we have a great commitment to education. Who would deny that? Who would deny that for their children and their grandchildren? Who instills those values? Not for the material gain that comes from education. Some of us become professors. Some of us lead industries. Some of us become statespeople. So the issue is not the material gain. The issue is the benefit back to the larger community. Point one. Point two, the social network that we build amongst ourselves to guarantee success for future generations. Very profound trait, if you ask me. Three, the willingness for, in this day and age, in the 21st century, for the diaspora, those of us that are the sons and daughters of the immigrants that came, the willingness to go and discover the roots of this land. I was there in 2012. When I came here when I was 3 months old, I went back when I was 3, which I don't remember. And my first trip back to India, having grown up here, was at the age of 27. How did that happen? How come his parents didn't let that happen? No, but they taught me the values while I was here in the small Indian community I grew up in California. But that wasn't enough. There's only so much the diaspora can teach someone of Indian roots. You have to go there and live in the structure. And all my hypotheses, all this education, all these PhDs and training diminished in a single moment when I felt during the course of the day the complexity of Indian society. The outsider won't know it. I, in many respects, am an outsider because I consider this my foundation and my upbringing. It's how I speak, it's how I think, it's what I know. But when I went to this place, and I tell everyone, I tell every non-Indian, I tell people from the West, I tell people from other cultures, I don't say this out of pride or arrogance about my own culture. India is literally the most mysterious and complex reality in the world. And to see an example of a people that built a democracy through nonviolence and peace, to see the vibrancy of an electoral democracy that takes 5 months, dwarfing the complexity of some of the Western elections that we see. It takes 5 months where you have 75% participation rates. Everybody's engaged, from the rickshaw driver all the way up to the chairman of the Tata Corporation. To see that type of success, and to see the peaceful transfer of power, and to manage that level of complexity and antiquity, meaning age, ancient nature of the civilization, and to aspire to higher goals, greater distribution and welfare, as Mr. Srinivasan was saying. Many goals that still lie further ahead, so much more to achieve, but the willingness to engage in social change and not to feel exhausted just by being an ancient civilization, not giving up, not allowing the democracy to collapse under its own weight, not to suffer from contradiction and paralysis. To me, I discovered that mystery when I went there. I don't know to this day, where does that energy and that will to achieve and survive come from? But then I took a step back, and I said, of course I will. It's in me too, because I got it from my dad and my grandpa. But what I don't have is the proximity towards human suffering. And so I want to close, how am I doing? Doing good? What I want to do is just close with a few remarks about tying the 5 points together. I think it's a wonderful achievement by the Modi government to institute the Constitutional Day. I think it behooves all of us in the diaspora, first, second, third, fourth generations, to understand the innate genius of this document and how it drew from the other constitutional frameworks. I want us to understand how it supersedes the limits of those frameworks. Because of what I'm saying is an intrinsic democracy in the Indian mind and spirit, how that democracy takes a secular form, how that secular form produces the conditions for success, and how in our culture, when we strive for excellence, we don't strive for just the self-promotion of the individual or the material gain. We're concerned about the betterment of humanity and society. And that, I firmly believe, is the line and the link that draws the birth of the Constitution and the inspiration of Mahatma Gandhi to our future success. So thank you very much. Sure. I guess we're taking questions from the audience.
Yeah.
4 questions.
So there are 2 things I would like to ask you. One is about demonetization by the Modi government. And do you think that it is going to do some good for the country in the short term? If we're not going to do anything good, what negative effects it is going to have? That's one thing. The second thing I would like to ask you is about secularism. In Indian context, the word secularism is used, misused, and used in 2 different ways. The state as such, the government as such, either at the center or in different states, the leaders interpret in different ways, and they exhibit that they belong to a particular community, a particular religion and all. Do you think that it is justified, or it was not properly thought of by the Indian constitutional framers, including Dr. Ambedkar?
Sure. Thank you for the excellent question, and I don't want to shy away from that. I don't want to turn this into a political debate, but scholars like Amartya Sen in his recent book, An Uncertain Glory of India and Its Contradictions, massive economic growth, deep regulations and reforms. India may not have its top 10 in GDP, but the crucial indicator of purchase-driving power could be number 3 in the world. And we're talking 5 to 6% growth rates, with the notion that this can trickle down to the rest of society. But as I said, given the legacy of Ambedkar, caste may not have been annihilated. The attempt was to annihilate discrimination on the basis of caste. His argument is that perhaps caste should have been the first that we would have to remove, but then that takes us to the very heart of the identity of the country, which the Founding Fathers obviously wanted to preserve. So many people can argue, not specific to India, but this massive economic growth, if not fairly distributed, the massive inequality in wealth, 90 billionaires, 1.3 billion people, 700 million people with poverty line. a post-9/11 framework that the whole world is responding to, where the peaceful coexistence of religious minorities, or perhaps the plight of the tribals and Dalits, that many do struggle for inequality, to overcome inequality today, and trying to understand the neoliberal model for economic growth and the improvement, inequality, the equality for all under the law, so everyone has the equal opportunity to succeed. That is a struggle not specific to India, but I would argue any Western liberal secular democracy that still operates by the model of free markets and growth. That is India's struggle. It's trying, it's striving. The intention is there and always has been there, regardless of the political party in power. The question is, can that be managed? Can that be managed in this country? That's another argument. Secular doesn't mean the same thing in every context. You're absolutely right. Look at the French. We took fraternity, equality, and liberty and put that into the Indian system. That's far distinct from its original roots in France. France went so far to say, no burqa in the public sphere. This is oppressive. This goes against liberty and equality and freedom, especially for women. In the public sphere, nothing religious should appear. And that guarantees that our Frenchness and our French identity is one that's inherently secular. There's no religious symbolism. In the US, for example, we would never prohibit someone from wearing a burqa. That is the free religious expression. So government can't use one single religion, let's say Christianity, and make that the foundation for all of its laws. In politics, a huge evangelical Christian base, which is very powerful, as you know, here in the United States, can influence the elections. It did in the last one. But in principle, the Constitution and the government says we cannot be rooted in one. And I believe in India too, in principle, since 1949 at least. The genius of India is to be able to draw from the strengths of the cultural diversity and all the elements of all the religions, but it should be rooted in one. Is it such a simple case? Some people may argue that yes, when certain powers come into existence and rule for a certain period of time, perhaps they draw from the values of one tradition and try to disseminate them universally. And some may contest that and say, well, that's violating the secular principle. But the interpretation of that is that you're looking at it from a Western framework where we separate something like a religion of Christianity from the secular law of the Constitution. Christianity does seep into our state laws, and it probably will on abortion and a number of other issues, maybe overturning the gay marriage law. So it's, on one hand, when the critics come after India and say, look what's happening, what's going on, this is the constant struggle you're going to find in every constitutional democracy. So I'll leave my comment.
Dr. Sampath, in a short time, you have really summarized extremely well. I have two questions. One is that I admire the way you have defined secularism. I agree with you. But in practice, it becomes very difficult to see that everyone can practice the religion that you want and express it if it is a conflicting with the national goals and with the national development and with the national integrity, so many issues of national what the Constitution says. Related to this is the caste system, which Dr. Ambedkar did say something about the caste, but it is so much entrenched in India that I don't see the benefits of having this caste practices, casteism practices, and the development of India.
You know, it's a great question, thank you, because I've looked at Western thinkers who had studied the Indian system long before the 20th century. Even Karl Marx had many views about the question of caste and the shift from a feudal order of the mode of production to a capitalist order, which is what India went through. Hegel, the great German philosopher, commented on it. And then, of course, within our own Indian context, from Fule to Ambedkar to Periyar, you know, the argument is that caste is not, one can say it originates from Hinduism. That doesn't really tell us much because it's so old, it's so built into the very structures. And the annihilation of caste, Ambedkar says, look, we can debate with the founding fathers about political reform, what kind of economic system do we take on? Is it socialist? Is it more of a welfare state? Do we have a separate electorate in politics? But he was really looking for a social revolution, which would annihilate the caste, and from there you rebuild the structure of identity. It's very hard. This is what I'm pained. I see the poignancy of suffering, but as I mentioned, I also have this admiration for my own ancestry, having witnessed and met people and studied, but really going to India and seeing it for myself for the first time. The difference between, let's say, the French system is that the social political revolution that took place also destroyed the hierarchical order of the feudal caste, the monarch, the king, the lords, and then the fraternity, the equality, the liberty of all citizens of the world. That's their legacy, that's the upgrade. They somehow managed to completely eradicate the structure of aristocracy and social differentiation. India went from a colonial system to the birth of this independent moment, but the pre-colonial legacy of caste, which existed in the colonial period, persists today, as you see. So the secular definitions of equality, liberty, and fraternity, and the reservations, and the specific provisions saying that we will help the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes have equal access to education and opportunity, translating that into the reality is not easy. But guess what? Think about the plight of minorities in this country and equal access and opportunity. Think about systems of exclusion and stratification. So I'm weary when we are overly critical of the Indian context because we have to understand the complexity, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. On the other hand, look at the limitations of other systems too with regard to how they're managing this inclusion. People ask me this all the time. This is why we discuss in our conferences. What is the legacy of Ambedkar? Who's going to take up this project of really looking at the philosophical possibility of either reform, so you can respect the persistence and continuation of something like Hinduism, but the peaceful coexistence of Hinduism with other religions. The Constitution names Jainism, Sikhism, and Buddhism as part of the Hindu framework by which you can then identify as caste and then compete for the reservations. But if you're in other Abrahamic faiths like Judaism, Christianity, Islam, in principle, caste doesn't exist in those religions, but in fact we know that they do. It happens everywhere. This is an eternal mystery. I'd like to stay on the side of hope. That if you can unleash the genius of 1.3 billion Indians, 3 million Indians in this country, and what we've done in a generation and a half, and you have 1.3 billion Indians that can unleash the same energy, each one an atom, that can build a galaxy of achievement, that to me is the promise. So I take a more delicate approach on that particular question.
I think that was your time.
Okay.
Just one last question.
Yeah, I have been a student of constitutional law, but now I'm in America, I believe this. Now I look back, not that egoistic point of I read the Constitution, but from
That's a great question. I think we can spend hours extending the question. I'll keep it brief because I know we have the rest of the time. I'll say this. The other great event close to 1949 is 1948, the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The architects of that document were predominantly Western. They said it was international, the UN, contributions from Asia, et cetera, but it was really Judeo-Christian in its roots. Which, by the way, for the Islamic world, for many years, they had some issues with the basic assumptions in the document. Hence, they produced the Cairo Declaration, based on the Islamic Sharia values. But here's India, betwixt the Middle East, which is focused on Islam. If you look at the Judeo-Christian roots in Europe and the European Commission on Human Rights, believe it or not, most of the European countries on the continental side and Northern Europe are going to be majority atheistic countries. Meaning it's not just secularism, it's just religion is babbling. Who knows what religion is placed. But India still has a commitment to its own, I'd say, religiosity and diversity. It hasn't had an opportunity to state the relationship between the principles in the Constitution and what are the real cultural values that the rest of the world can understand and learn. Yes, there was a superimposition by these other constitutions. Yes, there was a post-colonial event. But we've yet to actually enter the world stage. We're doing it economically, intellectually, politically. But we've yet to introduce that face of our antiquity and our culture and our civilization to the rest of the world as perhaps an antidote to why the documents in the West, particularly the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and its obvious roots in Judaism and Christianity. Judaism was born as a statement of justice and liberation from slavery. Whether you believe in the figure of Christ or not, the example of that story is a person who suffered. We have our own, across the world, religions present inside our context, many statements about justice and compassion. But we have to bring that to the world stage and educate people. And I think this platform is one excellent way to do that. So, thank you.
We have a group of students out here today. So I will give them let's give them an opportunity to ask two questions.
Sure.
My request, keep the questions brief and a couple of questions from the students, please.
Yeah.
Can you give me my mic?
Psychology student from Management University. Yes. So I wanted to ask, like the term US is US, but India, we use different terms like Hindustan, Bharat, Republic of India. So what is your take on it? Like Constitution has been changing interchangeably. So what is your take on that? Like for the youth to understand like these three terms?
It's an extraordinarily complicated question because if you say Indus, the people of the Indus, which is a Persian root, just the people that lived on the other side of the river, and then the pre-Vedic area. For example, I'm learning about my own Tamil roots. There's a Dravidian indigenous culture that's before the Indo-Aryan invasion. The secularism should mean something pluralistic and inclusive. India supersedes Hinduism. But for many, it's still, obviously, it's the majority of the country. And perhaps Hinduism is synonymous with diversity and inclusion. That it's so unique and complex that the other religions find a place within it. That's one statement of affirmation of why it's secular in a different way. Whereas if you said the US was the United States of Christians, that would be very exclusive and destroy our diversity and the principle of secularism. But it's very difficult in the Indian context because Hinduism, for some, especially the Western person or the outsider, they don't understand this event or this thing as also very much a part of a culture and a civilization that has had to interact in the course of different rules. Buddhist rule was Ashoka, then the Moguls, and of course the British, and the Victorian laws, which have Christian roots. So the reassertion after nationalism for it to be India, which was the project of Gandhi, was the project of Nehru, it is the project of the current system, we understand that. Can it be secular at the same time? Hindu and secular. My question.
One last question.
Well, if you're observing the recent events, you could see that in India, there is a greater use of sedition charges, almost for the purpose of suppressing freedom of expression. And it has happened against Amnesty International. It also, there are also about 18 other cases right now, being taken up for people posting on Facebook right now.
comments, and because I don't want to comment on specific cases or the Indian context, I can bring it back to the American context. There is a history of suppression of academic freedom of speech. That doesn't make it acceptable by any means. It happens historically in different phases. The McCarthy era for the communists, for example. The hyper-left were watched by the United States in the 60s during the anti-war movements. But I'll tell you, on American campuses, there's a different struggle now. Some people are afraid to speak. It's not so much speaking and then being suppressed. Some people, the other side of free speech, people don't understand. It's not just being free to say what you want, and does the government suppress it. If you're compelled to speak and think in a certain way, and only promote one ideology, that too is a violation of free speech in terms of liberty of conscience. And some people feel that maybe through political correctness or through other mechanisms, that people are programmed to think and speak in a certain way, others are repeating that. Again, I'm taking you away from the Indian context, I apologize. All I can say is that I would imagine for some, especially when it comes to academics, the history of universities in any place all over the world existed for one purpose: to use free inquiry, whatever modes of reasoning and science that was available in their time, to destroy myths, superstitions, ideologies, political fanaticism. And academics have suffered throughout history, right? When they try to break through and tell the truth. But yes, I understand the sensitivity. I do sympathize with the situation. And I think maybe a coalition or an international commission could, from the United Nations, for example, can come together and talk about, as a task force, the commitment of all nations to academic free speech as an answer.
But this edition clause in the Constitution is a colonial legacy.
Exactly.
So
it criminalizes
when we
speech.
admire all those great things we have gotten incorporated into this particular one, really helping to justice policies.
This is where political ideology overrides the constitutional principles for other purposes. And occasionally this happens in history. I don't apologize for it, I don't accept it, but it's something that we have to engage. I think